As we enjoy the dawn of a bold new generation from Nintendo, we have to ask the question at the outset: how long will Switch 2 survive? Could it approach, match, or even potentially exceed the original Switch's gigantic sales numbers? Will this be a long and healthy generation, or will this difficult second album go the way of some previous Nintendo sequel systems and fail to match up to its illustrious progenitor? Clearly, it will only be possible to truly know this in the fullness of time, and without doubt, the drumbeat of news articles about Nintendo's early sales with positive but carefully selected framings will continue to dazzle for as long as Nintendo can put them out. However, I want to take a longer lens still. There are certain things that we can examine now, including the things that will lead to a longer life or cut the system's life short, which moves Nintendo can make now and in the future to extend the life of the console, and how likely these are. In this video, therefore, we're taking the long view and deep diving the long-term prospects for Switch 2, from price to competition to marketplace expansion opportunities and more. Historically, Nintendo consoles have tended to be quite long-lived as long as there is market demand. The 3DS had first-party game support for a little over 8 years, and while the Wii and DS were cut off a little earlier due to the cratering of interest in the Wii late on, and potentially on the DS due to piracy issues surrounding the games, both machines had a solid 6-year run. Of course, the granddaddy of them all is the original Game Boy, which debuted in April 1989 and was still going strong when the Game Boy Color rocked up 9.5 years later in October of 1998 as essentially a kind of variant on the original machine, and Game Boy games were still available for backwards compatible play on 2001's Game Boy Advance. To put this lifespan into context, it's like if the original Switch stayed alive and the Switch Pro weren't released until 2026, with the Switch 2 finally coming in 2029. Then there's the countervailing examples: GameCube, Nintendo 64, and the dear old Game Boy Advance itself. The annals of Nintendo history are littered with the remains of consoles that surrendered way before their time should have been due. Where will Switch 2 fare? I think if you were to take the temperature of most people now, the most common statement I see is that Switch 2 will do decently well, especially as it clearly had a rocket start out of the gate, but ultimately it will probably not perform as well as Switch 1, which represents a huge mountain for any console to potentially climb. That remains a central likelihood, if only because that's where the vast majority of consoles fall. It seems unlikely, certainly on early numbers, that it will be a complete Wii U style flop. Nintendo has had a long time to get a very robust lineup of games in place, and they have a strong starting point with Switch, as well as multiple film and theme park projects to give them future opportunities to drive attention to Switch 2 and their hardware-software lineup. But the tariff issues within days of the April Direct prove that things can go wrong quite abruptly, and is also completely possible that, as has happened with prior consoles, the machine breaks out of expectations in a major way and actually outperforms anything we could expect right now. However, relying on people's expectations is unreliable. Very few people seem to have the central expectation that Switch would last 8 years, even relatively recently. The idea that it would be in its 9th year before being replaced seemed wild for a very long time, and yet, look what happened. From Nintendo's point of view, I'm sure their central aim will be to match or even exceed the 8 to 9 years that they got out of Switch. That's what makes the most sense for them at any rate. Changing consoles is risky, especially without the benefit of a backup system like they had in the days where they furnished the market with both home consoles and handheld devices. Furthermore, aging consoles benefit as they generally become cheaper to produce and manufacture, and games launch to a large install base. In this sense, the likely lifespan of the system probably correlates to the period of time it can continue to inspire a significant market demand. Switch at its height was shifting north of 20 million units a year, but even if Switch 2 doesn't have quite these spikes and maintains a steady pace of around 15 million units, that gives it the potential of a decade on the market. What seems like a pricey option now won't seem that way a decade from now, when an economy model like a Switch 2 Lite might be expected to be, with a price of, in today's terms, around $250 and boasting a library of jewel in the crown modern titles from the best of their many and varied franchises from throughout the Switch 2 era. Of course, more likely is that the console will have the standard trajectory of these kinds of machines, starting maybe a little north of 15 million units a year, climbing to a peak around year 3 or 4 in the 20 millions, and then dropping down, with the question only being how shallow Nintendo can make that descent. So, really, the key to longevity is finding ways to progressively expand the market of gamers and to find new markets for Nintendo's products. But expanding the market is something Nintendo has a long history with. In fact, if you haven't yet visited my Patreon page, there's a free feature-length podcast about the life and times of Nintendo's founder, Fusajiro Yamauchi, which shows that in surprising ways, expanding the market of gaming was a core occupation of Nintendo, even in the 19th century. So for the Switch 2, what can Nintendo actually do? I guess the most obvious lever that can move the dial is price. A cheaper sticker is certainly one way to carry the machine to an ever-growing base of new consumers, and it doesn't even require activity on Nintendo's part. If they can repeat the trick with the Switch of keeping the price at the same level and letting the machine's value naturally ebb away with prevailing inflation, it will probably help them to avoid the turbulence of abrupt price changes, which can create unforeseen knock-on consequences for only short-term gain. For that matter, if they can hold their price while the rest of the market are actually enacting price increases, they may still win some grudging plaudits of fickle commentators, though I wouldn't bet on it. In 2008, Satoru Iwata outlined the problem that Nintendo faces, saying, "It would not be a good idea for price cuts to be expected as a regular practice in the industry. Of course, I have never said that cutting the suggested retail price is not in the cards. However, price cuts in one country can certainly affect other countries. For example, when you say that we should cut the price in Japan due to the current domestic market situation, once the suggested retail price is cut in Japan, people outside Japan will anticipate the same around the world. 10 or 15 years ago, each country could decide its own price policy in the video game market, as you know. However, price policy has become a global subject in the recent years, so any price policy must be considered with the aim to maximize our global business. Because of this, we do not think just in terms of Japan. Also, while the price cut is said to surely increase demand, it must be clear from a variety of analysis so far that the effect cannot last very long. Accordingly, if we really do enact a price cut, it must be exactly when it can maximize the business. At least for now, I have no specific ideas about the price cut at all. End quote. So, if price changes have only a short-term effect on consumer demand, it makes sense that Nintendo may as well let inflation stretch this effect for them over a longer period while they focus on other things. But perhaps one of the most major factors is one that is largely outside their control: the competition. We can all imagine a counterfactual world where the PlayStation had never emerged to compete with the Nintendo 64, where Sonic the Hedgehog had never been invented, and so Sega's Mega Drive or Genesis had not quite managed to outpace the Super NES in the 90s console wars. Nintendo's current position is ahistoric, in that they really have had a rather pleasant niche all to themselves in the video game space. Switch 2 is not really in direct competition with the high-end home consoles, as the portability factor and even in some cases the capacity for cross-play in different settings mean that the console can thrive independently of Sony and Microsoft's offerings. Many people in fact own both. Now, perhaps those companies will seek to move into the hybrid space in years to come. There's certainly mood music in this direction, and reportedly around 2 million PlayStation 5 owners also have a PlayStation Portal, roughly 3% of PlayStation 5 owners. Still, like the Wii U to the Switch, the Portal might be put well in the shade by a truly portable PlayStation 5 offering. Sony has the chance to pull a Nintendo here, as the cutting-edge technology they employ in their systems in one generation could become the withered technology a decade hence, and so a 2030 release PlayStation 5 in a handheld form factor with an all-digital library of games carrying over could be a far stronger proposition in the market than at that point an aging Switch 2, which by then may struggle with many of the PlayStation 5 titles that are on the cutting edge, let alone cross-gen PlayStation 6 efforts. Now, the markets remain quite different, and Sony historically has not had much luck in the portable space, but even a small success in this field could dent Nintendo's status as everybody's side console. Another potential source of threat may appear to be the PC handheld market. Now, at this point in time, these machines are a tiny portion of the market. Switch 2 anticipated year one sales will lap them all multiple times without breaking a sweat. But nature and capitalism abhor a vacuum, and it's far from certain that Nintendo will be able to maintain this prime position indefinitely. Steam Deck style upstart entries have yet to make any significant impact on the marketplace, but few people in the early 1990s expected that Sega and Nintendo could or would be displaced from their thrones as the Jaguar, 3DO, and other console pretenders sputtered out quickly. Then along came the Sony PlayStation with a well-timed, well-priced market proposition that people felt was a really powerful offer on the market, and everything changed. There are two major danger points when Nintendo could find the crown dropping from their head. One is early on, when Nintendo is building up its install base. The precedent of the PlayStation in the 32-bit era is salutary, as that console competed with a rather fumbled launch from the Sega Saturn and a Nintendo console that literally didn't even turn up until many, many months later. Sony had all the time in the world to go around casually stealing Nintendo's lunch money. Nintendo has probably managed to head off such an eventuality, though, with the Switch 2. It seems unlikely at this point that there is a Switch 2 challenger that can seriously stop Nintendo from striding out to a very significant early market share over the coming couple of years. The second danger period will be in the late era of the console's life, when it is potentially, technologically, far behind the competition. Just as Switch lasted not just through the latter period of the PlayStation 4 and through much of the era of the PlayStation 5, Nintendo will aspire that their new system can last well into the era of the PlayStation 6. This is the best way to keep costs low and profits high, but there are risks to this, of course, specifically if new games are simply impossible to port to Switch 2, and so third-party allies who have been so important to the success of the Switch start to drift from the system. There is a classic way that console manufacturers have dealt with such eventualities in the past, the most obvious being the development of a slightly more powerful mid-gen refresh. Yes, start the clock on Switch 2 Pro talk. Look, long years of persistent rumours of a Switch Pro being just around the corner ultimately came to nothing, and it seems likely in retrospect that internal models designed to prototype potential Switch 2 hardware, as mentioned in Nintendo's Ask the Developer interviews, were confused with actual proposed tech upgrades, especially as the Switch OLED model was released. That said, Switch OLED also arrived at a time when the chip shortage and COVID-related difficulties made releasing a more powerful Switch not just difficult, but frankly, unnecessary. The original was already selling brilliantly, and it didn't need a second wind at that stage. That's not to say that these models for upgraded Switch hardware might not have been at least something that they considered for the market during the Switch era, and who knows, it may well have been part of the game plan had the pandemic not blown them off course. I think it's striking that Mario Kart World, a game that seems so much in advance of the original Switch, was still originally proposed for that Switch, and the presence of a Switch Pro potential mid-gen refresh could help to explain how they were going to pull it off. After all, Nintendo has done mid-gen upgrades before with both the DSi and the new 3DS XL, as well as arguably the Game Boy Color. Now, there are significant risks to any such innovation. I don't think that Nintendo would want a two-tier performance arrangement, as the cost of testing the vast combined back catalogue of Switch and Switch 2 games could be prohibitive, but if they can lean on software solutions to improve the performance of Switch 2 games for home users especially, this may be enough to swing around some more third parties to sticking with Switch 2 development. It also strikes me that Switch 2 is uniquely suited to a mid-gen refresh in certain respects because of Game Chat. A significant amount of the original Switch's processing power needs to be saved for game chat functionality, and Nintendo want this to be native to the system in order to drive people to engage with it and make it a core social feature of the Nintendo system. However, what if instead of releasing an upgraded console, Nintendo simply had a plug-in for the top port that included a better camera and microphone, but also some kind of internal processing capability dedicated solely to running game chat? Okay, this might feel a bit 32X-ish. For those who don't remember Sega's oddly mushroom-shaped contribution to the 90s gaming landscape, trust me when I say you've missed nothing at all. But by freeing up the Switch 2 to unleash its existing power, they could start to release games that don't permit game chat natively without the add-on. Now, can we really see Nintendo doing that? It's obviously a matter of trade-offs. They want people using game chat functionality as far as possible, and certainly when, say, the next Zelda games comes along, they will want people to be modeling its usage all the more. Having said that, selling high-priced accessories to Nintendo comes as naturally as breathing, and if people are invested heavily in game chat from the first 5 years of the Switch 2's position on the market, then Nintendo may be able to get away with it. It could also be the case that the audience for these sorts of top-tier behemoth titles that would require game chat-free processing power would have audiences largely immune to game chat's charms, specifically anybody born before about 2010 who, if they were interested in these sorts of social functions, may have already found their own equivalent on other apps. Still, it's not unprecedented for Nintendo to cut the legs out from under one of their unique selling points mid-generation. The 3DS found itself a dimension short, while the Switch Lite managed to get away with keeping the same name even for a console which conspicuously failed to, in any way, switch. At any rate, whether through accessorizing or iteration, I certainly wouldn't assume that the Switch's lack of a power boost mid-gen is particularly indicative of where Switch 2 might go, as I expect that Nintendo will analyze the market in a few years' time before making their decisions. Switch released 3.5 years prior to new Sony and Microsoft hardware, which can define the power level at the top of the market. It is possible, but probably unlikely, that we will have to wait similarly long, which will be until 2028, for new hardware to roar onto the scene this time. And while console generations do seem to be trending longer and blurrier, Nintendo won't want third-party gamers to become so divorced from their architecture that it simply becomes an irrelevance to them to play Switch 2. Once you break that connection permanently, it's far harder to get people back. None of this is certain, of course. It's also potentially the case that the law of diminishing returns will start to apply to future power bumps, making it seem unnecessary for Nintendo to be in any rush to look for a tech do-over. If the next evolution for Sony and Microsoft involves an attempt to embrace their own version of hybridity, this may be a risk to Nintendo in some respects, but it could also be a great opportunity for them, since it would mean that most third-party game developers would want their games to be able to scale up and down for more portable modes, and that means that they must remain in or close to the grasp of Switch 2's power level for longer. It must be said that as it stands, and considering it's been over 8 years, Nintendo's competition landscape doesn't look drastically different than in 2017. Sure, in 2017 they had the element of surprise, and it seems improbable that other companies won't at least be prototyping their own hybrid solutions, but nobody appears to have cracked it yet. And just as Phil Spencer observed that the Xbox One generation was the worst generation to lose because it was the starting point of many people assembling a digital games library, so the Switch generation was potentially a very good one to win, as the huge Switch install base and raft of games makes it a difficult one to crack. far from impossible. Steam, Sony, and Microsoft all have existing games libraries that they can leverage, but it at least gives Nintendo a bit of a head start in the space. I don't know that it's a safe assumption that the competition will remain broadly ineffective at countering Nintendo's market dominance of the hybrid space, but let's assume for the moment that this isn't a problem for Nintendo going forward. Therefore, what other things would we need to see for Nintendo to truly extend their generation on? To look at this, we need to consider back in time, because there have been times when Nintendo has in the past managed to drastically increase its audience, often quite unexpectedly. Indeed, I would say that three of Nintendo's greatest successes have been tied to moments that would have been basically impossible to foresee much ahead of time. Firstly, we have the launch of Pokemon in 1996 to such enormous acclaim and success that it single-handedly revived the Game Boy, a handheld which had been 7 years on the market and which had outlived what could easily have become its successor, the Virtual Boy. Nintendo is always working on new content, and they have confirmed their intention to release new IPs. Splatoon and Ring Fit Adventure have shown that they still have it in them to produce breakout new games, but with so many world-class developers and with a big budget, you wouldn't bet against them eventually creating a true breakout experience that could completely reshape expectations. Indeed, our second example shows this right out of the gate: Wii Sports. The thing about Wii Sports is that while Pokemon re-engaged children with the Game Boy, Wii Sports pushed the Wii into a whole new audience demographic. And while, yes, that was the plan, I don't know that ahead of its release it was necessarily obvious that that plan would work. The same approach with the Wii of going to try and capture a completely different generation of consumers wouldn't be replicable now directly. It's harder now to find people who have no direct experience with Nintendo simply because Nintendo has been around for 4 decades now, meaning that even people in their 50s may have childhood memories of Nintendo content. Still, new markets don't need to be simply new generations. What if they were able to create some innovations that helped disable players or tapped into a new market such as fitness? Game chat is clearly an attempt to tap into the potential of social gaming, and there is a new generational audience that Nintendo may be able to capture from it, specifically the under 10s. If in 10 years' time many people under the age of 20 then have nostalgic memories of the Switch 2 being one of their major ways to communicate and socialize with friends, the skepticism of Discord users in 2025 will barely register as a footnote in video game history. I'm not saying that this is necessarily likely, but it seems clear to me that game chat has that level of ambition driving it, and whether it's an instant hit like Wii was or goes down in history as a complete flop, Nintendo are unlikely to be done trying to find new things, and in a 5 to 10 year window, there has to be a decent chance that they will strike something out of the park. The third example of a real success, though, comes from global circumstances, specifically the huge surge in demand for the original Nintendo Switch during the pandemic. That was clearly an unusual black swan circumstance, but odd things do happen in the world, and these could dramatically alter the trajectory of the console's life for either good or ill. Clearly, predicting any specific event would be difficult, so I'll give a couple of examples, but to be clear, these are not in any way predictions, just illustrations of how quickly things could turn. So for one, let's say that a major agreement on tariffs leads to video game consoles being hit with swinging markups, but there's a carve-out explicitly for mobile communication devices in the final deals. Well, Switch 2 is already mobile, and if Nintendo were to add a cellular modem and allow SIM cards, perhaps alongside a cheaper variant, they could be in the position where their now $400 system is competing with Sony and Microsoft machines that are, in US terms, $1,000. Of course, Sony and Microsoft would eventually adapt, but it might take them longer, and in the meantime, that price differential could be hugely beneficial to Nintendo. Or a scenario that could go in quite the other direction. Let's say that tensions with China escalate, and so China uses its considerable leverage in Africa and the Middle East, one through its expensive and expansive Belt and Road initiatives, to throttle ocean cargo through routes like the Suez Canal, and potentially utilizes drones to frustrate cargo flows. America at this point may prioritize goods from companies which have a domestic footing, such as Microsoft and perhaps Sony Interactive Entertainment, which could leave Nintendo out in the cold. And of course, that's before we get to all the general purpose black swans, wars, pandemics, an 1815 scale volcanic eruption, or a major hit to power grids or communications infrastructure, whether from terrorism, natural disasters, a once in a century solar flare, or what have you. All of these are desperately low chances in any given year, but over the long term, they are things that will have outsized bearings on Nintendo's fortunes in ways it's impossible to really predict. COVID was, from the point of view purely of their balance sheet, something that they turned to their advantage, whereas the 2011 tsunami, beyond being a humanitarian catastrophe, had huge impacts on the whole country of Japan and thereby on Nintendo. This is why I would expect Nintendo to continue to have multiple contingency plans up their sleeve, but also to avoid showing their hands too early unless they have to. Still, if we assume relatively benign conditions which lead Nintendo systems to sell at a steady trickle, there's no particular reason why they can't do very well indeed. One likelihood I've flagged for some time, and which still seems like a good bet, is that they will continue to use the top USB port as a way to add accessories to extend the life of the console. This has a huge benefit to Nintendo because they can make money off individual accessories and test the market for those accessories without both the cost and the risk of incorporating them into a new system. Essentially, their standard sources of profit are console sales and game sales, and while one would assume that the game sales are more profitable because they tend to sell anywhere between 10 to 20 games for every console sold, they still do rely on a steady stream of hardware sales as well. However, if they can diversify this hardware to accessories, then it may reduce their reliance on simply selling Switch 2's. They have already put a canary down the mine, or rather a rodent down the mine, in the form of mouse mode, which has the potential to be a portable companion for PC players who would like to pick up their favourite games on trains and planes. Adding on more facilities to enthrall new players would evidently be to Nintendo's benefit. I have already mentioned the fitness market, and I expect to cycle back to this in another video at another time, but I do think that this is a major potential source of revenue for the company. Wii Sports, Pokemon Go, and Ring Fit Adventure have already shown that this is in Nintendo's wheelhouse, but fitness and lifestyle is a vast global industry with oodles of potential for gamification. If they had a Nintendo wearable that plugged into Switch 2, perhaps a device to aid accessibility, maybe another that allows for gesture sensing, then Switch 2 could become simply the hub device for a suite of Nintendo electronic toys and devices which might individually be lower cost but higher margin for them than the base console, and would encourage Nintendo to keep the Switch 2 ticking along for longer than would otherwise be the case. But ultimately, their ongoing mission must be to expand the market of gaming, and if they can't do this through thrilling new software, then they must do this strategically through other means. One interesting piece of news in May was the confirmation of accessibility settings such as live captioning for game chat. The proportion of disabled people in a population grows progressively with age, with estimates suggesting that in the US context, in 2022, 6% of 5 to 15-year-olds had a disability compared to over 24% of people over the age of 65. Historically, this has not been a huge problem for Nintendo. Until the Wii and DS era, the concept of even trying to target older gamers appeared eccentric. But in this generation, many of the teens who first embraced Nintendo gaming on the Famicom and the NES will be approaching retirement age. Flush with disposable income potentially, the chance to spend their days playing Nintendo's vast offerings of titles may be tempting, but not if they are prevented from playing them by disability. Now, not all disabilities are ones which can be easily addressed by gaming accessibility design. Mobility and hand-eye coordination may be tricky, and while Brain Age was marketed as a way to manage cognitive decline, it's not clear that a video game can actually mitigate these issues all that drastically. Some issues are already solvable. Deaf people with cochlear implants can stream audio using the Switch already, but the low latency Bluetooth capabilities of Switch 2 will be more compatible with a wider range of cochlear implants and hearing aids. Immobility, deafness, and social isolation are correlated strongly with aging. So, while I have talked about game chat as being marketed significantly to the very young, I also think it has quite a bit of potential utility for older generations of perhaps more casual and nostalgic video game players who wouldn't be able to work the Discord, but are happy to get together online with friends and family. Ironically, for people who are hard of hearing, it may actually be easier to communicate with people in this way if the microphone is as effective as Nintendo claim for isolating the speaker and cancelling background noise. And from my early tests, it does appear to be quite effective. Hearing aids especially have traditionally been blunt instruments, amplifying everything, and while cochlear implants have wind noise reduction and directionality, it's easy to imagine that the nursing homes of the 2040s could see people sitting with a blanket and a copy of Animal Crossing, visiting towns, and chatting with friends on Game Chat. The thing about nursing homes is that they are close communities where trends can catch on. This is one of the things that drove Wii Sports' reputation for allowing anyone to play. But the point of this is that unlike the noughties, Nintendo don't need to crack a bold new market. They just need to ensure that their content continues to be accessible as time goes by to people who are already potentially interested in what they have to sell. Okay, we've looked at a lot of different aspects that would affect Nintendo's ability to continue to sell Switch 2 and potentially to even eclipse the Switch, but surely the biggest issue is one we haven't yet touched on: expanding into new territories, or at least capitalizing on territories where they are currently barely even a player at the present time. While Nintendo has had fairly long established sales success in Japan, Europe, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and North America, the rest of the world is a trickier matter despite representing a huge slice of the global population. They experimented with penetrating China in the Switch generation, and with the Switch being discontinued in 2026, it seems that the Chinese consumer remains an elusive target for Nintendo. It's not impossible that Nintendo would try again, but pinning their hopes on China for sales means they are completely at the whims of a foreign political regime at a time when tensions with the West are running relatively high by modern standards. They say a week is a long time in politics, so the next decade is an eon, but even if Nintendo can launch Switch 2 with massive success over the coming year, it's difficult to imagine that breaking China will be a huge component of Nintendo's business. Nikkei put out a statement in April saying that Nintendo was putting off the Chinese launch of Switch 2 as, due to government regulations, there is not much software available and sales have not been growing. They noted that it is believed that the company will assess demand. I would anticipate that they will try to enter the market at some point, and while the million Switch units reportedly sold in China by January 2021 may seem like a boil on the backside of the Switch's more than 150 million units, if Nintendo can leverage its existing fan base there and, over the long term, push that number up a little more, there is still high potential. After all, there has to be a promise in a market of 1.4 billion people whose disposable income is increasing fast, up to 40,000 yuan in 2024, which is double the statistic from 2015, less than a decade ago. Mind you, these are all from China's own National Bureau of Statistics. Still, if Chinese manufacturing bases become eroded over time, it may play to Nintendo's strengths that they can sell consoles made in China to the Chinese. What of other markets? Latin America has a smaller population than China, around 650 million people, but that's still a decent starting point. And Nintendo has definitely been raising the mood music, albeit with rather mixed results. Shout out for bringing this to my attention to Ghostabo and RZB, whose YouTube channel is surely the most electric Brazilian video games export since Blanca. However, it seems that in the February Pokemon Presents, where the Pokemon Company announced proudly that they would be making their games available locally to Latin America by announcing the games would be localized to Latin American Spanish, but not mentioning Portuguese at all, they nevertheless chucked in some footage of Brazil. As Ghostabo commented, it was hilarious, not to say extremely tone deaf. Even if Nintendo are far better advised on how to approach the market south of the US border, the return on investment for operating there is less clear. While there are a huge number of people, the average disposable income is much lower, meaning that Nintendo may find the return on their investment quite low in the medium term. In many respects, the old style situation where consoles would have been staggered in their global releases may have been more beneficial here, with the Switch 2 being able to enter the market in this region later at a relatively cheaper price with a ton of games, but the emergence of the internet and a more internationalized gaming community mean that Nintendo will need to take drastic actions such as using region-specific prices in exchange for local payment options only being usable. They have done this before, but it's technologically tricky and it risks affecting the perception of the value of their games in the broader market, especially with Hair Trigger drop the price activists being especially vocal at publicizing these differences. It also seems like something that is far from a priority for Nintendo if their system can be expected to last 7, 8, 9 years. They could set a date in the diary for a big board meeting to discuss the Latin American market in 2030, and the same market will likely still be there, and at that point, they may have far greater flexibility in terms of options. If affordability is a problem in Latin America, it is the same story in many other parts of the world, including the huge potential market of India. While the headline population figures of 1.4 billion Indians look promising, India has long been a mobile first market due to widespread access to lower cost phones and decent 4G access, while internet cafes have offered PC gaming. Gadgets 360 reported in 2018 that their own unofficial estimates put the PlayStation 4 uptake at 250,000 units sold and only 30,000 for Xbox One. In a sense, Nintendo might benefit here as they are the lower cost end of the console spectrum, but the costs to operating there are high. Localization would be needed for mass market penetration, and the costs of this would likely be very high for many games, while they would also need to develop distribution networks afresh. It's not impossible, but the return on investment may not be clear in the medium term. Still, like China, Indian disposable income is rising over time, which means that if Nintendo can offer a Switch 2 Lite type console and market it well in India, it has a decent chance at being able to crack the country at least to some degree. The same can be said of other nations such as Vietnam, whose burgeoning video game industry, projected to double from its 2024 baseline of 1.2 billion US dollars by 2023, is largely propelled by esports and a younger population playing primarily free mobile games. This is one area where Nintendo's mobile strategy will come into play. In many ways, the company seems to have backed away from majoring on mobile in recent years, with the only significant new non-Pokemon themed game app being Pikmin Bloom in 2022, and with dear old Dragalia Lost and Animal Crossing Pocket Camp shutting their doors. However, at a recent investor briefing, Shuntaro Furukawa confirmed that they were not done with mobile yet, and only weeks later we saw the launch of Nintendo Today. One curious statistic from 2019 reported in PocketGamer.biz was that 12% of Mario Kart Tour downloads were from the country of Brazil. If Nintendo can use a similar approach in India and other locations to inculcate a grassroots demand through their apps, it lays the groundwork very nicely for a console push later in the generation. It's also just lower risk for them to transpose a mobile game to a new market, and it allows them to build capacity in their internal systems, marketing contacts, translation facilities, and other connections that may allow them to try the more substantial effort of launching a high-priced consumer electronics product. We don't know exactly when Nintendo will make any of these moves, of course, but Satoru Iwata was talking about expanding into Asia back in 2011, despite the risks of these markets being resistant and so-called copy heavens flooded with pirate software already. His view then was as follows, and I quote, "If you look at the global population, Japan's population is declining, and Europe and the US are increasing, but not as much as Asia. In addition, Asia has higher economic growth, and considering that consumers categorized as middle class and above, or the people who have enough food and clothing, desire entertainment to enrich their lives, and the number of such consumers will be increasing on a large scale, I think it is necessary to expand our business in Asia." On the other hand, regarding conducting business in Asia, there are many discussions about whether what we have done in Japan, US, or Europe will really work in this market, or to what degree consumers will accept our products in the current copy heaven environment. Therefore, that gives us more reasons to localize to the local language, understand the local culture, and recognize what things the local people value and will pay money for. If we were selling daily necessities, it would be acceptable to make and provide cheaper and better things, but that is not the case for entertainment, and we would like to show our results after we research what entertainment local people will really enjoy. We are proceeding with investment, organizing teams and product plans to develop business in Asia, since I think that this will be one of the most important fields in the next few years, and I believe I will be able to explain more about it in places such as business reports when we have specific details. End quotes. Perhaps, though, we shouldn't rule out locations closer to Nintendo's existing territories, specifically Eastern Europe. These nations have their own distinct historical relationships with Nintendo. While 80s kids were enjoying Donkey Kong and Mario for the first time on the east side of the Berlin Wall, people were not making these kinds of memories that now bring nostalgia. Over time, the video game industry in Poland especially has grown, with both iconic titles like the Witcher series as well as content in Nintendo's own orbit, such as Donkey Kong Country Returns HD developers Forever Entertainment being based in Poland, with whom Nintendo of course struck a development deal some years ago. Poland may not be the size of India, China, or the entire South American continent in population terms, but nevertheless it is a large emerging market with around 35 million residents and a growing game development community. Nintendo has been used to making a case for its games based significantly on nostalgia appeal, but that won't work quite the same way in this case, and so they need to build a significant affinity with Nintendo characters and products in the country first. Of course, this will compound over time, and especially as Poland has become much more Western facing. Polish translations of video games are rarer, but Nintendo routinely translates into Dutch, and there are reportedly barely half the speakers of Dutch than there are of Polish. The relatively large Polish diaspora in Germany, where Nintendo of Europe is based, should also surely both raise the salience of the issue and provide them the understanding they may need to enter this market all the sooner. I would anticipate that the films will continue to help with this, and especially the Zelda trilogy, if it's successful, which might be hoped to tap into the same kinds of fantasy audiences that were engaged by the Witcher series. Obviously, there's a big risk at being perceived to try to do a version of a country's successful cultural export, but Zelda represents a great potential bridging franchise for families where parents wish to share the Witcher obsession, but their children aren't quite ready for the mature themes. What would a success look like in terms of numbers? Well, let's take the roughly 30 million Switch consoles sold in Western Europe. It's a little higher than that, but of course, some of those would have gone to Eastern Europe already. The population of Western Europe is estimated as 200 million, that's roughly a 1 in 7 attach rate. Let's say that they could get a 1 in 10 attach rate in Poland. That's 3 to 4 million extra consoles. Also, Polish translations at least get a foot in the door for places outside Poland, but where the Polish language is a little more commonly spoken, including in Lithuania and Ukraine. But however well Nintendo do in managing to expand the market of Switch 2, and however lucky they are in warding off competition, most consoles eventually reach saturation point. In the Wii's case, its explosive early sales potentially hastened its demise as the console lost traction and relevancy fast around 3 or 4 years into its life, which surely did not help Nintendo with the transition to the Wii U. Many people were concerned that Nintendo had even left the Switch 2 launch too late, with the 2024 lineup of Switch games feeling particularly bare bones, and many people were anecdotally reporting that they had stopped playing Switch or were playing it much less, and a very modest drop in annual playing users was reported by Nintendo themselves, although Furukawa has also said that the numbers are roughly the same, so it was at least within a rounding error. So, look, with Nintendo's market expansion driven by their IP activities, with the potential for innovation from Nintendo and to capture new markets, and with the possibility of one off events working for them as well as against them, I think there is still a lot of potential for Switch 2 to run and run. But as the end approaches, the thing that may prove shockingly crucial to Switch 2's sales numbers is its own successor. If Nintendo go down the Switch 2 route and commit essentially to Nintendo Switch consoles all the way down, then there's no reason to rush such a Switch 3 device to market. However, just because they've made an iterative move this time does not mean that they will or even should make the same kind of move next time, especially when the Switch form factor at that point will be nearly 2 decades old. If Nintendo wish to pivot to something more ambitious and experimental, then I would expect them to launch a new console much sooner than 8 or 9 years' time, perhaps even in 6 years' time, alongside a new Zelda title, thereby allowing them the security of having the Switch 2 to fall back on. This precedent was seen with the DS, where the Game Boy Advance was actually going very strongly, but the DS allowed them to get a jump on the competition. Of course, it was an odd system in many ways and could well have failed, like the Virtual Boy, in which case Nintendo would have always had the Game Boy Advance waiting in the wings, just as the Game Boy outlasted the Virtual Boy by a good many years. So, are Nintendo going to go back to the well of innovation? Maybe. Although the DS and Wii era saw an unusual burst of creativity, the NES to Super NES to N64 showed a core of form factors that were broadly similar, even if the N64 in particular boasted a huge degree of innovation in certain respects. The fact is, though, I'm not sure Nintendo necessarily needs their core console in itself to be the font of all innovation if they're using software and accessories to drive changes. For all the changes over the years, Switch 2 is clearly in the same lineage as the Game Boy and even the Wii, and I suspect Nintendo may feel that they have found a form factor in Switch and Switch 2 that requires less drastic innovations between consoles, but that through their toys, software, and other endeavors, they can branch out from. The addition of that top facing USB port still feels really important to me, as they can innovate and experiment at a far lower cost and risk just by having stuff bolt into the Switch 2. There are limitations, of course. VentureBeat's interview with the Switch 2 development team confirmed that the top USB was for video in, not video out, for example, and there may be other restrictions on its functionality. Still, Nintendo are masters of lateral thinking with existing technology, and they don't need to wait for new hardware to add new functionality necessarily. They just need a game that requires it to shift sales. Now, in a way, this was always the case. They could have launched Wii Sports on GameCube with the Wii Remote as a new GameCube accessory. However, in that case, it wouldn't have made sense because they wanted this new device to have a chance to sell to the casual audience over the long term, as such consumers are unlikely to buy on day one and so need lots of so-called warm-up marketing to warm them up to the concept of the Wii. Therefore, I think it's actually innovations for the casual audience that need to be built into new hardware. Think game chat, while more niche gaming applications like a 3D second screen or even VR, both tricky without video out but potentially doable, which would better suit add-ons where Nintendo can leverage a larger install base, potentially interested in trying something new out without the ongoing cost of building it into their hardware. Once the Switch 2 crosses the 100 million sales threshold, which I believe it will around the turn of the next decade, the install base would be sufficient that they could try these more expensive add-ons as a way to upsell existing owners of the system. Of course, this won't work if people sense that a new system is just around the corner, so they would need to be clear that the Switch 2 is in it for the long term, and that the precedent of Switch's longevity will probably give people confidence that their expensive new bolt-on won't be abandoned in a year or two like past attempts at similar functionality enhancement. Hello again, 32X, but also 64DD and others. Look, all of these things are potentially quite marginal. I would not expect a Switch 2 to rocket to 300 million sales, and even matching or exceeding 150 million would still be a truly epic task.
But while it seems on base likelihoods improbable, it's not completely unlikely, and Nintendo could go a long way with the combination of many of these incremental effects. Good luck with the competition, the emergence of a new major game that expands their market, intelligent expansion into new territories, keeping aging gamers on board with innovations particularly around disability access, and a pricing strategy that makes the console ever more accessible. If the next generation console's lifespan tends to trend longer anyway, and Switch 2 could push to 9 or close to 10 years before being superseded, then there's more time to sell variants, and once you're into that kind of longevity, higher sales become more plausible. And yet, there is one last roll of the dice that Nintendo could use in the mid 2030s to push their console into true record breaking status. If we think back to 2017, the Switch was not the only big time new entrant to the console marketplace from Nintendo. They also zhuzhed up the Nintendo 3DS space by debuting the new 2DS XL. Now, I don't think at this point in the Switch's life such an iteration really makes sense. It's not clear that any enhancements could be offered at a low enough price point, or at least with a high enough margin than models currently on the market, and the Switch already has a low-cost model in the Switch Lite. It still seems possible that we could see the odd Switch 1 variant, perhaps Mario ones around the release of the Mario movie, but I'm not convinced any longer that a full new Switch revision is on the cards if it ever was. But in the Switch 2 era, things could look different. Let's say the production costs of the machine drop in that decade, and their eventual next console is an experimental affair that doesn't completely convince the market out of the gate, and many games are still cross-gen with Switch 2 and its purported successor even in 2035 or 2036. Let's say that Nintendo therefore decide to buy themselves some time. A stylish final model Switch 2 might not move the dial hugely, but it could be enough to get Nintendo over a hump until their successor either finds its feet or is replaced. Shades of what happened with the Game Boy and the Virtual Boy. Ultimately, these kinds of records are forged over the very, very long term, and however likely or unlikely it may look at the moment, I think there is a long time for Switch 2 to outpace expectations, and who knows, perhaps one day enter the record books all on its own. Shout out to TSP184 for the video suggestion. Thank you so much to the channel's Patreon members and to everyone who has liked, commented, shared, and subscribed. Do check out these videos on screen for more, and I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.